In 1933, in a fishing village on the Georgia coast, a linguist named Lorenzo Dow Turner sat across from an elderly woman named Amelia Dawley. He pressed record, and Amelia began to sing. 5 lines, a melody she had carried her entire life, words she could not translate, a song her mother had taught her, and her mother's mother before that, reaching back through generations no one could count. Amelia did not know what the words meant. She did not know what language they were in. She only knew that the women in her family had always sung it and that it mattered, that it had always mattered. Turner wrote the words down phonetically. He filed the recording. He moved on to other work. And for decades, that song sat in an archive, waiting. It turns out, the song knew something that the rest of America had not yet figured out. Something about who the Gullah Geechee people actually are, where they truly came from, and what they managed to carry through the most brutal passage in human history. Because the story most people were told about the Gullah Geechee, the one repeated in textbooks and whispered in academic halls for generations, was wrong. Not slightly wrong, fundamentally wrong. And when the DNA results finally came in, they did not just correct the record. They revealed something that should stop you in your tracks. Let me show you what I mean. For most of American history, the Gullah Geechee were misunderstood in almost every way a people can be misunderstood. They live along the coastal lowcountry and sea islands of South Carolina, Georgia, and parts of North Carolina and Florida. More than 30 barrier islands strung along the Atlantic coast, separated from the mainland by salt marshes, tidal creeks, and thick canopies of live oak draped in Spanish moss. The air smells like pluff mud and salt. The land is low and flat, barely above sea level, laced with waterways that flood with every tide. Beautiful. Isolated. And for centuries, that isolation was treated as evidence of something lesser. Their language was called broken English. Baby talk, a sign that enslaved Africans had failed to learn the master's tongue properly. Their traditions, their food, their basket weaving, their ring shout worship, their way of burying the dead with personal objects facing east toward Africa, all of it was filed under folk curiosity at best. At worst, it was dismissed entirely. Here is what nobody asked. What if the Gullah Geechee were not the remnant of people who had lost everything? What if they were the opposite? What if they were the people who had kept more of their original identity than anyone else on the continent? That question did not even become speakable until someone bothered to listen to the language. Really listen. Turner was the first professionally trained black linguist in America. And when he heard those 2 students speaking Gullah at a South Carolina college in 1929, he did not hear broken English. He heard structure, grammar, rules. He heard the echo of something much older than any plantation. So he went to the Sea Islands. He spent years there, recording conversations, collecting words, studying syntax. And what he found was extraordinary. Gullah was not degraded English. It was a Creole language, with a grammar derived from African languages. He identified over 300 words borrowed directly from West African tongues. He cataloged nearly 4,000 African personal names still in use by Gullah families. Names like Sori, Tamba, Kadiatu. Names that had crossed the Atlantic in the holds of slave ships and survived intact for 200 years. But the detail that stayed with him, the one his widow said he cherished above all others, was something even more remarkable. In remote sea island settlements, Turner found people who could still recite songs and story fragments in Mendi, in Vai, in Fulani. Not English, not Gullah Creole. Actual African languages, passed down mouth to mouth, mother to daughter, through centuries of enslavement. Think about what that means. Think about the sheer force of will required to hold on to words in a language you were never supposed to speak again, in a country that punished you for speaking anything at all. Turner published his findings in 1949 in a book called Africanisms in the Gullah Dialect. It should have changed everything. It proved that what America called ignorance was actually preservation. What the Academy called failure was, in fact, the most successful act of cultural resistance in the Western Hemisphere. But the book was largely ignored. The academic establishment was not ready to hear that Black Americans had retained African culture in any meaningful way. The prevailing belief, held by white scholars who had never set foot on a sea island, was that the Middle Passage had wiped the slate clean. That enslaved Africans arrived in America as blank pages. That every piece of their language, their customs, their spiritual life had been torn away by the violence of the crossing. Turner had spent 2 decades proving this was not true, and the response was silence. The Gullah stayed invisible. Their language continued to be mocked, their traditions continued to be dismissed, and the assumption held, the one that said enslaved Africans arrived in America stripped of everything, language, identity, knowledge, as if the Middle Passage had been a kind of erasure. It was not, and the things that survived were not scraps. They were systems, entire ways of cooking that blended West African one-pot rice traditions with low-country ingredients to create dishes like red rice, purloo, and okra soup. Entire systems of medicine, carried by root doctors who used sassafras and yaupon holly and other local plants, combining herbal knowledge with spiritual practices passed down through generations. An entire approach to death, where the belongings of the deceased were placed on the grave, shells and bottles and personal items arranged with care so the spirit could find its way. Every piece of it traceable, every piece of it African. And here is where the DNA begins to tell us just how completely that assumption was wrong. In 2021, a team of researchers published the most comprehensive genetic study of the Gullah ever conducted. They used whole-genome data, comparing Gullah individuals from the Sea Islands with African Americans from Jackson, Mississippi, and with populations from Sierra Leone and across West Africa. The results were stunning in their clarity. The Gullah carried higher African ancestry than any other African American population ever studied. Their European admixture was remarkably low, less than 10%, and on the maternal side, the numbers were even more striking. 100% of Gullah mitochondrial lineages traced back to Africa, every single one, no exceptions. Compare that to the broader African American population, where about 3% of maternal lineages show European or Native American origin. The Gullah showed 0. The maternal line was unbroken. Now, here is where it gets deeper, and honestly, this is the part that I keep coming back to. For over a century, there had been a cultural story about the Gullah that they came primarily from Sierra Leone. The evidence was linguistic, it was cultural, it was historical. The Gullah language sounds remarkably like Sierra Leone Krio. They share identical expressions. The word big yai means greedy in both languages. Tiff means steal. Sweet means delicious. About a quarter of all African-derived words and names in Gullah trace to Sierra Leonean languages. The rice connection sealed it in most people's minds. In the 1700s, colonial planters in South Carolina and Georgia discovered that rice would grow in their coastal marshlands. But they had no idea how to cultivate it. Rice is not a simple crop. It requires intricate knowledge of water management, tidal flows, soil conditions, planting cycles, and processing techniques that European colonists simply did not possess. So, they specifically sought enslaved people from what they called the Rice Coast, the traditional rice-growing belt of West Africa, stretching from Senegal down to Liberia. Sierra Leone sat right in the heart of it. Planters paid premium prices for these people, sometimes double what they would pay for captives from other regions, because their agricultural knowledge was worth a fortune. Let that sink in. The colonists could not do it themselves. They needed the expertise of the people they enslaved, and that expertise, carried in the minds and hands of stolen men and women, built the entire low-country rice economy from nothing. And there was Bunce Island. a tiny British slave castle in the Sierra Leone River, about 20 miles upriver from Freetown. The island is barely 500 meters long and 100 meters wide. The ruins are still there. Crumbling stone walls, an open-air yard divided between a large area for men and a smaller one for women and children. Watchtowers. Cannons bearing the royal cipher of King George III. Tombstones of slave traders and ship captains at the south end, their names still legible. This was the departure point, the loading dock. The last piece of African soil that tens of thousands of people ever touched before being shipped to Charleston and Savannah. It has been called the most important historic site in Africa for the United States. And its primary business was feeding human beings into the rice plantations of the American Southeast. In 1989, a group of Gullah community leaders made their first pilgrimage to Bunce Island. They called it a homecoming. Hundreds of Sierra Leoneans came in boats and canoes to witness the occasion. The moment was recorded in a PBS documentary called Family Across the Sea. 3 years later, General Colin Powell visited the same ruins while on an official trip to Sierra Leone. Standing on that crumbling stone, he said something he had never said before. "I am an American," he said. "But today, I am something more. I am an African too. I feel my roots here in this continent." That is what Bunce Island does to people. It forces you to see the connection. It will not let you look away. So, the story felt settled. Sierra Leone to the Sea Islands. One line, one origin, one connection. But the DNA said something more complicated, and in many ways, more powerful. Yes, there was a slightly closer genetic relationship to Sierra Leone. The data confirmed that. But the Gullah were not simply transplanted Sierra Leoneans. Their genomes carried signatures from populations across a vast stretch of West and Central Africa. From the Senegambian region, down through Guinea, into Nigeria, and south to Angola. They were not one stolen people. They were many stolen peoples who, in the crucible of the Sea Islands, became something entirely new. If this video is beginning to change how you see this community, consider subscribing. Stories like this deserve to be found, and the only way that happens is when people like you help carry them forward. And this is what makes the Gullah Geechee story so extraordinary. Because what happened on those islands was not cultural death. It was cultural creation. People ripped from a dozen different ethnic groups, speaking different languages, carrying different traditions, were thrown together on isolated plantations surrounded by marshland and disease. The white planters could not even stay. Malaria and yellow fever thrived in the swampy coastal plain, especially around the flooded rice fields, and the Africans carried inherited resistance that their enslavers did not have. The plantation owners were vulnerable, so they moved their houses away from the fields. They left the islands entirely during the rainy summer and autumn months when fever ran rampant. The day-to-day work was managed by a handful of white overseers and by enslaved foremen. But in practice, the enslaved were left largely alone. They outnumbered the white population by enormous margins. And in that isolation, something remarkable happened. Languages merged, traditions blended. A new culture formed, one that drew from Mende and Temne and Fulani and Yoruba and Congo, from a dozen streams that met in the salt marshes and became a single river. Gullah Geechee was not a remnant. It was a synthesis. An act of collective genius carried out under the worst conditions human beings have ever imposed on other human beings. The sweetgrass baskets woven by Gullah women today, coiled strand by strand in a technique passed from mother to daughter for generations, traced directly to Senegambian weaving traditions. In praise houses, tiny wooden buildings that served as the spiritual heart of Sea Island communities, the ring shout still happens. Men and women move counterclockwise in a circle, feet shuffling against the floorboards, clapping, singing, voices rising until the room feels like it is breathing. It is one of the oldest surviving African American worship traditions in existence, and it is unmistakably, undeniably West African in its roots. The graves face east, toward sunrise, toward Africa. Now, let me tell you about the song, because the song is the part that will stay with you. Remember Amelia Dawley, the woman Turner recorded in 1933? 5 lines in an unknown language. Decades later, an anthropologist named Joseph Opala, who had spent years studying the connections between Sierra Leone and the Gullah, found Turner's old recording. He brought it to an ethnomusicologist named Cynthia Schmidt and a Sierra Leonean linguist named Tazief Karoma. They spent years studying the lyrics. And then they did something extraordinary. They took the recording to Sierra Leone and played it in village after village, walking through the interior, asking one question. Does anyone know this song? Weeks passed. Nothing. The Mende are the largest ethnic group in Sierra Leone, numbering in the millions. Finding one song in that vastness was, by Schmidt's own admission, a remote possibility. But Karoma had noticed something. One word in the song belonged to a dialect spoken only in the Pujehun district, in the Deep South. So they narrowed the search. And on their last day in the area, in a tiny village called Senehun Ngola, they found a woman named Bindu Jabati. Jabati listened to the recording, and then she began to sing the same song, nearly identical words, an ancient Mende funeral dirge, performed during a ceremony called Tejami, which means crossing the river, a song for guiding the dead home. Imagine being in that room. Imagine hearing a woman in a village in the interior of Sierra Leone singing the same melody that an old woman in coastal Georgia had carried in her throat for her entire life. 200 years apart, 5,000 miles apart, and the song was the same, not similar, not an echo. The same words, the same meaning, the same purpose. What Jabati told them next is the part I cannot shake. Her grandmother had taught her the song. And her grandmother had told her this, that the family members stolen during the slave trade were not all gone, that one day some of them would come back. And when they did, this song would be how she would know them. Those who sing this song, her grandmother said, are my brothers and sisters. A grandmother in a village in Sierra Leone, speaking across 200 years, predicting a reunion that would actually happen. Because in 1997, Mary Moran, Amelia Dawley's daughter, traveled to Sierra Leone. She visited Bunce Island, where her ancestors had been loaded onto ships, and then she was taken to Senehun Ngola, where Bindu Jabati was waiting. The two women sang the song together, the same melody, the same words. 200 years and 5,000 miles apart, and the song had survived on both sides of the ocean. Mothers teaching daughters on the Georgia coast, grandmothers teaching granddaughters in the Sierra Leone interior. The thread had never broken. Mary said something afterward that I keep turning over. The song was never that important to me, she said, until I found out where it came from. Then I thought of the woman who brought it over, and I thought, the only thing she could take from Africa with her was this song in her heart. That is what she took. Not gold, not possessions, not even her own freedom. A song. And it was enough. The village's blind, 90-year-old chief, Nabi Jah, was asked why a woman stolen 2 centuries ago would have taken this particular song with her, and not some other. His answer was immediate. It was the most valuable thing she could carry, he said. Because just by singing it, she would remain connected to every ancestor who had ever been buried with it, and to their continued blessings. Then he said something that became the title of the documentary made about this story. You can speak another language, you can live in another culture, but to cry over your dead, you always go back to your mother tongue. The language you cry in. And here is what the DNA adds to that story. Because for a long time, the song and the language and the baskets and the ring shout could be called coincidence by skeptics. Cultural parallel, convergent evolution. people grasping for connection where none existed. The genetics make that argument impossible. The 2023 study of the Anson Street burial ground in Charleston took it even further. 36 individuals from the late 1700s unearthed beneath a city street. The Gullah Society initiated the study. Researchers extracted DNA from bones that had been in the ground for over 2 centuries. 18 genomes were recovered. The results mapped ancestry to West and West Central Africa. One individual showed genetic affiliations with Fulani populations. Another carried lineages from coastal West Africa. They came from different places, different peoples, different lives before enslavement tore them from all of it. And yet, they were buried together, with beads draped carefully around them, with personal objects placed beside their bodies. With the kind of attention that says, we may not share blood, but we share something. These were not random disposals, these were burials. Artifacts of care and intention that speak to a community that chose each other even when biology could not connect them. Only one pair, a woman the community named Isi, and a 6 to 8-year-old child named Walela, shared a maternal lineage. Out of 18 people, the rest were strangers who had been made into family by circumstance and by choice. That is what the DNA reveals, again and again. Not a single origin story, not one clean line from point A to point B, but something messier, harder, and ultimately more astonishing. A community forged from fragments, a culture built from memory and will, people who were told they had lost everything and who, in the face of that lie, created something so resilient that its genetic fingerprint, its linguistic fingerprint, its spiritual fingerprint can be tracked across an ocean 200 years later. A 2026 study went further still. Researchers examined mitochondrial DNA from 79 Gullah Geechee individuals alongside 110 African Americans from other regions. The Gullah maternal lineages were 100% African. Not a single non-African haplogroup appeared. The researchers proposed something that would have been unthinkable a generation ago, that the Gullah Geechee may represent a founding biocultural population, a genetic and cultural seedbed from which much of legacy African American identity branched outward. The people who were dismissed as isolated, as backwards, as remnants. They may have been the root. Consider what that means for every African American who has ever been told that the trail goes cold, that the records stop at a plantation ledger, that the connection to Africa is untraceable. The Gullah Geechee may be the living proof that the trail never went cold. It just went underground, into songs and baskets and burial rites and the double helix itself. And if the Gullah carried it most visibly, it does not mean others lost it entirely. It means the code was always there, waiting for someone to learn how to read it. There are things we still do not know. We do not know the full extent of the ethnic groups represented in Gullah ancestry. The reference databases for African populations remain incomplete, and each new study reveals layers that earlier ones missed. We do not know how many Gullah Geechee descendants carry these lineages today, because the migrations of the 19th and 20th centuries scattered people from the Sea Islands to cities across America. An estimated 1 million people may have Gullah Geechee roots and have no idea. And we do not know how much longer the living culture will survive in its current form. Development presses in. Hilton Head, once a Gullah community, is now largely resort golf courses and vacation homes. Kiowa Island is nearly unrecognizable. Climate change threatens the low-lying marshlands that protected these communities for 300 years. The language is endangered. The youngest fluent speakers are aging, but there are people fighting for it. On St. Helena Island, the largest Gullah community on the South Carolina coast, more than 5,000 descendants of enslaved plantation workers still live. Elders in their 70s, 80s, and 90s still sing spirituals in praise houses, the same small wooden buildings where their ancestors gathered in the evenings, away from the watchful eyes of enslavers, to pray and sing and shout in their own way. Those songs can be traced back to the first book of African American spirituals ever published, recorded on that same island in the 1860s. Songs that changed the world. You probably know one of them without knowing where it came from. Kumbaya. That song originated here, on the Sea Islands. The word kumbaya is Gullah for "come by here." It was a prayer, sung in praise houses by enslaved people calling out to God in their own language. And it traveled from these islands into the American mainstream without anyone ever crediting the people who created it. Basket weavers in Charleston who learned from their mothers, 5 generations deep, still coil sweetgrass strand by strand on the same streets where their ancestors were sold. Musicians blend Gullah melodies with modern sound, so the tradition travels forward instead of standing still. And Morehouse students who visit the praise houses come out, in the words of one cultural preservation leader, transformed. The Gullah Geechee Cultural Heritage Corridor stretches across 4 states now. Congress established it. The National Park Service helps administer it. It is the formal recognition of something that should have been obvious centuries ago, that these were never broken people holding on to scraps. They were the keepers, the ones who carried the most intact bridge between Africa and America through the worst passage human cruelty could devise. And the DNA does not just support this, it makes it undeniable. I keep thinking about that song, the one Amelia sang for Turner in 1933. 5 lines in Mende, a funeral song for crossing the river, passed from mother to daughter on the Georgia coast for 200 years, while on the other side of the Atlantic, a grandmother in Sierra Leone taught it to her granddaughter and told her, "One day, the lost ones will come back. You will know them by this song." She was right. They came back. And the song was the same. Some things survive because people refuse to let them die. Some things survive because the people who carry them understand, in their bones, at a level deeper than words or science or any genome sequence, that the song is not just a song. It is the proof that you were never erased. That you are still connected to every ancestor who was buried with those words on their lips. That the river the song was written to cross, the one between the living and the dead, between Africa and America, between what was stolen and what was kept. That river was never as wide as the people who stole you wanted you to believe. The Gullah Geechee were never what we thought. They were more than what we thought. They always were.